Good morning. Life can be mundane. Wake up, eat, sleep, and try to do something useful in between. Life calls us to certain tasks. We need to pay for the food we eat and the place we sleep. Those who are lucky find work that fulfills a purpose beyond that. Those who are most fortunate earn enough to retire, but the lack of a job creates a void. Who are we when we are not our job? I've seen many in this congregation who dedicate themselves to the arts, paint something beautiful or profound, or to put one's hands in the clay and reshape the earth, to build something new. In the arts, abstract or realistic are categories, and sometimes they're not useful categories. They assume that the functional is not beautiful, or fail to see that beauty serves its own function. And many in this congregation volunteer in various civic organizations or just in personal relationships and helping those who are sick or in need. This is unpaid work that serves a purpose. The reward is not money, but meaning. Life can drift from function to function. We choose a path or we wander onto one. Viola Liuzzo was a housewife, a profession that is often disparaged as mundane. But what could be more important than raising the next generation? James Reeb was a minister, a high-minded profession, but often contains the drudgery of being a housewife, settling squabbles between the children, and trying to create a space for people to grow. And people can settle into these professions and form a bubble around themselves. We become what we do. Our calendar reminds us of who we are today. Calendars themselves are an act of commitment. We say we're going to do something and then do it. Figure out what is important, then make our plans. But according to John Lennon, life is what happens to you when you're busy making other plans. James Reeb and Viola Liuzzo lives were interrupted by another interrupted life. John Lewis was a black child, born into the Jim Crow South. Smart lad with a way with words, and he wanted to be a preacher. As a child, he even preached to the chickens in the barnyard. He went to college and became ordained as a Baptist minister, but he never made it to church. As a student, he participated in lunch counter sit-ins. Just wanting equality at lunchtime made him a radical. He called it getting in good trouble to make change. just wanting equality in public transportation made him one of the original freedom riders in 1961. By 1963, he had been arrested so many times that everybody noticed what a dedicated servant to civil rights he was. At the age of 23, he was one of 6 speakers chosen to speak at the March on Washington. The elders saw the future and wanted it on stage. The next couple years, he started working for voting rights in Selma, Alabama. This is when he came to the attention of James Reeb and Viola Liuzzo. A march was planned from Selma to the capital of Birmingham. The first march went terribly wrong. John Lewis led the march of 600 people. We've all seen the videos. His small body in an oversized light coat was an easy target for the Alabama State Police, who nearly beat him to death after he crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge. After the violence of what came to be known as Bloody Sunday, President Johnson promised to submit the voters' rights legislation. Organizers called for a march the following Tuesday to be led by Martin Luther King Jr. Clergy from around the nation were asked to join. James Reeb and other UU ministers responded. Reverend Mark Morrison Reed described the events in a winter 2014 edition of UU World magazine. Quote, "In the early hours of Monday, March 8, 1965, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. dispatched a telegram that read, 'The people of Selma will struggle on for the soul of the nation, but it is fitting that all Americans help to bear the burden. I call therefore on clergy of all faiths, representatives of every part of the country, to join me for a minister's march to Montgomery on Tuesday, March 9th. In this way, all America will testify to the fact that the struggle in Selma is for the survival of democracy everywhere in our land.'" Reverend James Reeb was in his office in the Boston neighborhood of Roxbury when the call from the UUA came around noon. Reeb, a white American, had forsaken parish ministry to work and live in the African American community. He wanted to go to Selma. After a hectic afternoon, he went home to talk with his wife, Marie Reeb. As the parent responsible for taking care of their 4 children, including an infant, she questioned why he needed to go. They had walked side by side at the March on Washington in 1963, but having watched the broadcast the night before, she knew that this march was different. She strenuously objected, while he steadfastly insisted, until reluctantly she ceded to the urgency of his need. Unquote. Tuesday's march did not last long. Instead of proceeding without a court order of protection, which they knew was in the works, but not present at the time of the march, King held a prayer meeting on the bridge and turned around. turnaround Tuesday was a remarkable act of reconciliation. But to show that white supremacists and racists cannot be appeased, later that evening, walking home from a local diner, Reeb and 2 other ministers were attacked. Reeb was hit in the head with a club and died 2 days later. King spoke at his funeral on March 15th. And again, I read the words of Mark Morrison Reed. Quote, "That evening, President Johnson addressed a joint session of Congress and uttered the now famous words with which he introduced the voting rights bill. At times, history and fate meet at a single time in a single place to shape a turning point in man's unending search for freedom. So it was at Lexington and Concord. So it was a century ago at Appomattox. So it was last week in Selma, Alabama. There the long-suffering men and women peacefully protested the denial of their rights as Americans. Many were brutally assaulted. One good man, a man of God, was killed." 2 days later, the word spread that a federal judge would permit the 50-mile march from Selma to Montgomery and ordered that it be protected both by state and federal governments. Unquote. This march was 52 miles long. It required logistics. They actually believed it was going to happen. The first 2 marches, they pretty much knew that they would be stopped at some point along the way. But this time, they needed people to be marching because it was certainly unsafe to march at night. And so they'd be marching about 10 miles per day. And people were needed to drive marchers to and from where they would be marching each day. Some would be able to stay overnight at friendly farms and campsites that had been pre-designated, but lots of people had to be shuttled back and forth. This is where Viola Liuzzo became involved. As a side note, I learned a couple things about Viola that I didn't know. She was born in 1925 in Washington, Pennsylvania, where my own father was born in 1924. That part of Appalachia was very poor. And many people moved from there to Michigan, where the auto industry provided jobs. My father's family moved to the town of Ypsilanti in 1927 or 28. Viola's family moved there in 1941, where I imagine they attended high school together. This blows my mind that my dad might have talked to this woman. But that is where their stories diverge. My dad graduated and went overseas for World War II. He returned, got married, and moved to northern Michigan. Viola dropped out of school after 1 year and got married, and she stayed in Detroit and had 5 children. She joined the Unitarian Universalist Church and became involved in the NAACP. After a protest in Detroit, she decided to go to Selma to help with the 3rd March. And she worked as a volunteer, shuttling people back and forth. And after the march was over, and they had successfully reached Birmingham, she and a 19-year-old black man named Leroy Moulton were driving back to Selma after a long day's work, when their car was rammed, shot at, and eventually run off the road. Viola had been hit by a bullet and died almost instantly. The young man was covered in her blood, and he survived by pretending he was dead when the men came to check the car. They were members of the Ku Klux Klan. No one was convicted of her murder. There was a dispute in the court over who owned the gun and who fired the gun, and so nobody was convicted. 3 people were convicted under the 1871 Ku Klux Klan Act. The 4th person was an FBI informant who was also in the car. He was placed in the witness protection program. In order to cover up the FBI's involvement in this, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI started a smear campaign against Viola Liuzzo. What type of mother leaves her 5 children at home to ride around in cars with black men? They even suggested she was on heroin. The autopsy showed no drugs in her system. It took her children until 1978, 13 years later, to get the FBI to release the autopsy to clear her name. Her husband, a Teamster official and activist, supported her work. Reading from an article in the Detroit News, Anthony Liuzzo talked with the president and told him the 4 Klansmen who told him the 4 Klansmen had been arrested. Liuzzo thanked Johnson and said, quote, "I don't think she died in vain, because this is going to be a battle. All out as far as I'm concerned. My wife died for a sacred battle, the rights of humanity. She had one concern, and only one, in mind. She took a quote from Abraham Lincoln that all men were created equal, and that's the way she believed." Unquote. It is interesting to note how gender and class interact in these stories. Reeb, a white male professional, was treated as a hero. Liuzzo, a working class woman, was treated with suspicion. Her husband had to publicly defend her, and the rumors were allowed to stand for years. When the family sued the FBI about their involvement in this case, they lost the case and then were charged tens of thousands of dollars for bringing the case against the government, who had an informant involved in these killings. Things have changed since then. We've moved forward, but I fear that we are moving backwards. White supremacists are given deference. When white supremacists stormed the Capitol, white senators have said they were unafraid because they knew that these were law-abiding citizens, even as law enforcement officers were being attacked. The Congress recently passed a resolution to honor the police who defended the Capitol. 12 people voted against the bill honoring the police because the attack was called an insurrection. Many states around this country are actively trying to suppress the votes of people of color. The voting rights has already been gutted by recent court decisions, and the John Lewis voting rights bill is trying to fix this, but is unlikely to survive a filibuster. The entire Republican Party is against getting rid of the filibuster, and certain white male members of the Democratic Party are also against getting rid of this Jim Crow relic that ensures a minority veto. What are Unitarian Universalists going to do? Our fifth principle says we will affirm and promote the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and society at large. Each of us need to look at what our commitment is to this principle. We are headed towards minority rule in this country. In 1960, 88.6% of Americans classified themselves as white. The 2017 census estimates that has decreased to 73%, and less than 62% are non-Hispanic whites. And if you're counting non-Hispanic white men, that makes that about 30%. And not all white people are against racial equality. But those who are trying to gerrymander and suppress votes so that the white supremacist minority in this country, a minority that is too large but is still indeed a minority, they want to rule this country. And they're getting violent and more desperate. A gunman was found outside the vice president's home recently. There is an active state of war happening, a war against democracy, and we need to treat it as such. We look back on those days of our heroes and martyrs, like James Reeb and Viola Liuzzo, and wonder, what would we have done if we had lived in such a time? We live in such a time. Which side are you on? Do you want people of all races and classes and gender to be encouraged to vote? Or do you want to make it harder for working class people and people of color to vote? And yes, this is also a woman's issue because poverty disproportionately affects women in this nation. To have a work day be the only voting day excludes people who have to work for a living and don't have the power to tell their boss, I'm taking the day off because I need to vote. We need to expand voting. We need to make sure that everyone has access to the ballot rather than crowding people in long lines. Let us keep our eyes open and be prepared to act. Georgia is one of the states that's most active in trying to overthrow democracy. They are planning to restrict voting days before Election Day. This will result in longer lines. And knowing that it will result in longer lines, they are also written into the bill that they are prohibiting bringing water to people who are standing in long lines. They are creating a problem and outlawing compassion. It's up to us to water the seeds of democracy. We must commit ourselves in any way that we can so democracy will grow and flourish. As we've learned today, it is part of our heritage. It will be part of our future only if we choose to work today. May we bless and be blessed.